So let's talk through some scary Warhammer 40k melee options that can level up your close combat and lead to you getting charged on units further away and snagging objectives that you otherwise might not have done. Time to swarm the enemy with some slingshot maneuvers. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about some very slightly more advanced melee maneuvers, with choosing some tactical charge targets and getting the first strike on some unlikely targets as a result. I've touched upon this one a little bit in a few different videos, but let's look at some very specific scenarios in which it can give you some advantages, in particular for some massed up infantry squads. For this one we're going to assume you know the basics of melee and Warhammer 40k. For a quick recap, in the charge phase you can charge one or more enemy units. To complete the charge you have to move at least one model into engagement range of them, and your units must base if you can. While doing so you've got to stay out of engagement range of units that you didn't declare a charge on. Your charging units are generally going to be able to activate and fight first, and when your unit is chosen to activate you get to pile in 3 inches towards the closest model, getting into base contact if you can, and this includes any closest model that isn't necessarily in the unit that you just charged. Then you fight, make your attacks and deal damage, and then you may choose to consolidate after if you'd like to and you're eligible to. The main gist of the slingshotting style tactic is usually to use models that don't go base to base, which sometimes won't necessarily always be an option. It depends on your unit and the charge target, but if the thing that you're charging is a long way away and you have lots and lots of models in your unit, there's at least a pretty good chance that not everything will get into base to base contact. It wouldn't be an option for these Terminators charging these Gretchen, for example. They're relatively spaced out, you've only got 3 models in the Terminator squad, and they've just rolled in 9 to charge. So no matter how you arrange them, all 3 of those Terminators will be winding up having to get into base to base contact with one of those Gretchen they just declared on. For bigger units that are further away though, you're probably going to have models that aren't going to be able to make it into base to base, either because they just don't have enough movement distance to be able to get there, or because there's not enough space and they're blocked out either by your own models or some terrain that happens to be nearby the units. Any models that aren't able to get into base to base contact have quite a lot more flexibility as to where they could go. Say in this charge move, the 2 Terminators that could move into base to base contact with the Termagants have done so, and then all the ones sort of highlighted in yellow here, they could really be quite flexible as to where they go behind those 2. They don't have the distance to base any of the other models, so you could string them all out to one side or the other, or keep the unit in a really quite dense clump in the middle. Their only restriction are they have to move at least slightly closer to the unit that they declared as a charge target, but that's still loads of flexibility given that you could move parallel to them. The main gist out of this whole tactic is that trailing tail of units could be used to threaten other enemies that you didn't declare a charge on or get to objectives. In 9th edition previously you weren't able to make attacks into units that you didn't declare as a charge target, but there's no such restriction in 10th edition, so they could very much be a melee threat to other things that they didn't charge if they've got enough movement to get there between their charge move and pile in. To gain more flexibility with how you might be able to use these models, it's fairly common to be able to use your own models to screen out the movement of other ones of yours later on. Say for example we've got these 3 Space Marines charging the Gretchen. They've just made a 7-inch charge roll, so if you moved the back guy first he would have enough distance and he would have no choice but to get into base to base contact with that first Gretchen model. If you move him first then the unit doesn't really have any options or flexibility. He's moved into base to base contact with the first one, and then the other 2 Marines moved in turn have had to base other Gretchen in the unit, so you've not really been able to gain any decision making there. They just need to move in and hit those Gretchen hard. If you choose to move those models in a different order though, things could be very different. In this example we've moved the Marine in position 1 first, he's based the first Gretchen, then we've moved the Space Marine in position 2, he's also based that guy, and basically done it in such a way that the 3rd Marine can't get through anymore with that 7-inch charge move, so now he's got far more choice of where he goes, provided it's sort of broadly towards the enemy units. As a result, if you really wanted to guarantee that you had at least one model on this objective marker, he could make that happen. He's used that 7 inches to move so he can both still fight the Gretchen and also be on the objective marker, so hopefully he can maximise damage and make sure his Space Marines still have some presence on that marker, even if they roll badly and wind up not wiping the unit and aren't able to consolidate onto the objective as a result. Potentially though, if you were fairly confident of wiping out the units, you could factor in the amount of movement that you think you'd be able to get from consolidate, and that could allow you to tag enemy units or move onto objective markers really quite a long way away. In this one, a slightly bigger Space Marine squad has charged into the Gretchen, wiped them out, and used the remaining models in the squad that couldn't get into base to base contact as a bit of a tail leading towards an objective. They're hoping that they're able to wipe out the Gretchen models, as if they do the squad's just free to consolidate onto an objective marker. So it means that you potentially wiped out an enemy unit and still being able to tag that point. It wouldn't necessarily need to be an objective marker as well. It could be an important enemy squad that you want to hold up and cause some disruption to. Say for example that same Space Marine squad was fairly confident that they were going to charge and wipe out a few Chaos cultists. They could use a trailing bit of the unit to allow them to consolidate towards and tie up the next thing. In this case there's some Chaos Havocs that don't really want to be in melee as they won't be able to fire next turn. By attacking the cultists and consolidating into the Havocs will be able to strike back at you, but that might be the better case of affairs as opposed to them lighting up with guns next turn. I guess for this one maybe you could have charged both units potentially, though it might have been a longer charge distance or left your squad weirdly strung out between the two units. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor at ObjectiveMarkers.com, who wanted to share their range of faction themed battlefield accessories with you guys. These disc-style objective markers tend to be pretty common accessories for Warhammer 40K. The idea is that you have a 40mm circle in the middle of the disc, and then the 3-inch scoring zone measured out to the edge of the disc, so you can tell at a glance whether or not miniatures are within range to score a point or not. These guys' take on this is to have the disc be a clear one so you can see the base of the battlefield through it, so it doesn't detract too much from the playing environment, and then add the design on the objective to add a little faction theme to it. They've got quite a range of designs out there, including the standard channel merch Auspex design. That one's a bit more faction agnostic. Beyond that, there's lots of themed ones that could be appropriate enough for various different armies in Warhammer 40k. Ones that work for Chaos, Greenskins, various races of Xenos, different power armoured chapters, and plenty more. I quite like their Space Elf and Greater Good designs as well. They do have a few other things on their site. Check out their ruined terrain bases if you'd like to take a look at those as well. But in any case, they'll be linked down in the video description. Thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Another fairly common thing that this could be used for is to counter fights first. I've certainly talked about this a few times in the past, but potentially you could charge one unit and have that trailing tail of a unit being all ready to pile in and fight against something that has fights first before that thing could strike back at you. In this case, the Terminator squad chose to target just the Termagants as the charge target, and as a result were only able to get into engagement range of them and not with the Lictor during the charge phase, as they didn't nominate him. Then there's only one ongoing combat on the board here, so the Terminators would get to activate first. When you activate, you do the entire process, so you pile in first, then you fight, then you consolidate until you move on to the next unit. And that means that the Lictor won't be able to interrupt and fight first, as he wasn't in melee when the Terminators activated. Potentially in this situation it's meant that 3 or 4 Terminators can all hit Death Leaper to maximum effect before Death Leaper gets to strike and maybe kills a Terminator or 2. So by doing these charge phase shenanigans you might have saved a Marine or 2's life. This isn't without risk though. If the Terminators had rolled a super high charge roll, more of them might have needed to base with the Termagants and ruin the whole manoeuvre. I bear in mind though that the opponent could potentially counter this if they've got command points in the bank though. Heroic Intervention is 6 inches, so if you're in range to be able to pile in and fight that unit, they're going to be in range to Heroic Intervene against you. So if they really wanted to, the Tyranid player could see that coming, and after the Terminators of all positions, to give them a good punching with Power Fists in the charge phase, they could choose to spend 1 command point to Heroic Intervene. In this case, Death Leapers try to make things awkward by jumping into the last Terminator, which means that with his inbuilt fights first rule, he'll be able to be selected and activate before the Terminators get to, maybe kill 1 or 2 of them, so at the very least deal some damage, and maybe even save his own life if that takes down enough Terminators so he doesn't die in return. Getting into high-minded shenanigans now though, and he could counter that counter, if it was just critically important that your squad was able to hit that character first and not the other way around. You could maybe use something like a small sacrificial unit to feed to the fights first unit. In this case, the Space Marine player had 1 lone Space Marine left. He's charged him into Death Leaper, not expecting him to actually deal any damage, and Death Leaper will kill him before the Terminators get to act. But it does mean that if he charges first, then Death Leaper isn't going to be able to Heroic Intervene to jump into the Terminators. And again, the Terminators would get the first strike here. This one is likely to be fairly on the niche side though, and probably more effort than it's worth to think around for something like Death Leaper. Maybe something big and scary with fights first, like a big block of Judaseer Blade Guard, or Lionel Johnson or Fulgrim or someone could be a bit more worthy of throwing in chaff units to make sure that you can hit the fights first units. As well as fights first, this could also be a way to beat the counter-offensive stratagem, 2 command points to interrupt in melee. In this situation we've got the Terminators that have charged the Termagants, and they ideally want to be hitting a Haruspex first nearby. But due to other melees going on around the map, they know that if they go straight into it, it's likely going to just interrupt and kill most of them. The Space Marine player also has a Dreadnought charging into a Norn Emissary, and let's say for this situation that they see that as the more important combat and the one that they want to resolve first. Doing a manoeuvre like this potentially could allow the Space Marine player to fight first in both situations. If they just directly charge the Haruspex as an interrupt after they've fought with the Redemptor Dreadnought and kill some Terminators, because they've done this after they've activated with the Redemptor Dreadnought. If the Tyranid player wants to use the counter-offensive stratagem, the only thing that they can use it on is the Termagants, as they're the only other unit that's actually in melee at this point. It means that it's likely not worth spending the 2 command points to interrupt there, and then it'll be the Terminators go, and they can use that pile-in trick to hit the Haruspex first, so basically deny the Tyranid player the option to use that stratagem. I'd bear in mind that while these tricks are all rather fun and potentially a bit high-minded, it's certainly possible this could kind of blow up in your face as well. It does mean that actually rolling too high on a charge result could shut all of this down. So say if the Terminator squad was at least somewhat close to the Termagant unit, and then they wind up rolling a double 6, even with clever screening things, you might still be in a place where each one does actually have to get into base contact with an enemy model. We might just have one trailing Terminator that isn't going to give you as much leeway as you need, potentially to the point where it might well have been better just to engage Death Leaper directly and take a bit of damage but guarantee that you kill him, as opposed to potentially risk not enough damage or all your squad having to attack the suboptimal targets. You are likely to have more options with either bigger squads or models with bigger bases though. I think it would feel at least fairly rare that if you have a big squad worth of 40mm base models, that you're not going to be able to keep at least one of them out of base-to-base contact if you really want to. Another potentially interesting use of this is that it could potentially make your charges on units that are farther away quite a lot more reliable. Again, provided that you've got a sort of stepping stone unit to boost you along the way. In this situation, we've got a great big unit of 10 Terminators, so there should be lots of scope for having models that can position themselves elsewhere. And ideally, if they can, they'd really like to get their Power Fist to work on that Tyranid Hive Tyrant, though he's a big 9 inches away, so it might not be so easy to get attacks on him. If they just go with the straightforward approach to this, they're going to need a 9-inch charge, so that's going to be odds on to fail even with a command point reroll, and if they fail that, they won't even get the Termagants as a consolation prize. As a result, likely the most reliable way to get damage on that Hive Tyrant would be just to declare the Termagants and then use the pile-in move to engage the Tyrant if it's possible. So here the Terminators have just declared on the Termagants only and rolled a 7 on their charge move. Some of them have to go into engagement range and base to base if they can with the Termagants, though given a big squad there's plenty of models that just won't be able to do that, and they move basically directly towards the Hive Tyrant and still satisfy the charge move criteria, as they are still getting closer to that Termagant unit overall. Given you needed a 9-inch charge on the Hive Tyrant, it should mean that some of those Terminators are around 2 or 3 inches away from it, and now it's the closest model for several of them, they can get into engagement range with it. So basically now when the Terminators come to fight, they can use the pile-in move to get into close combat. The ones that are still closest to the Termagants must move at least slightly closer to them and base if possible. The ones that are now closer to the Hive Tyrant must move towards him and again base if possible. So basically you've gained around about 3 inches worth of charge threat range on the Hive Tyrant, and essentially kind of made a 10-inch charge on that thing with a 7-inch charge roll. And if you had rolled a bit higher as well, you might have had even more theoretical threat range. Again, this one's going to be a bit better with big Horde style squads, ones where you're guaranteed to have models that can't get into base-to-base contact. Though in this particular scenario, even if we'd rolled a 12 with that many Terminators and quite that big bases, we should have had plenty of opportunity to screen out the furthest away ones with the closest ones. I particularly had this demonstrated in a big way recently, with say a great big unit like Ghazghkull and 20 Orc Boys. That unit, perhaps more than most right now, is going to have some pretty massively serious options with being able to do this. And maybe getting even more interesting because Ghazghkull's quite such a focal damage dealer model out of the unit, where it doesn't necessarily matter quite so much where any given Orc Boy is going, provided Ghazghkull himself can get into the right thing. Say for example, if that unit wanted to charge and clear a bunch of Tyranids models nearby, it could potentially just declare a charge on the closest one with that Hive Tyrant, and then prepare to do a bunch of slingshotting and overrunning into all the rest of the units. As expected, with an easy charge they managed to make it. Let's say they roll a fairly average 7 inches, and that means that with just a small amount of boys you completely block out the Hive Tyrant, the rest of them are able to go basically wherever, provided it's just very fractionally closer to that Hive Tyrant. It means that Ghazghkull himself has sidled up to the fight's first units, and lots of Orc Boys aren't so very far away from other Tyranids units as well. And again, they might be getting charges very reliably against things that were say 10 inches or so away, without actually needing to risk rolling a 10 and failing in the first place, as they basically move 7 with the charge move, and then they can move up to another 3 with the pile-in move, so could be in a position to sweep up a whole bunch of units here. As with the others, you'd also be preventing any of these units from using counter-offensive or fights first, unless they did some other trick like Heroic Intervene. Then when it comes to the boys' interaction, they pile in another 3 inches. They all go 3 inches towards the closest target to that individual model. It means that you're now swinging first against a whole load of Tyranids units across the line, and in particular wherever you've chosen to put Ghazghkull is really going to hammer that unit in particular. So if possible, he's probably going to want to go after the single most important threat, whatever you deem it to be. This one's maybe a bit tangential, but you could also potentially game a longer charge more reliably if you have multiple of your units ready to charge against a stepping stone style unit, even if you don't have these trailing models. For example, here we're playing as the Tyranids, we've got a Swarm Lord next to a unit of Tyranid warriors, and the Orcs have a big walker that we want to charge, and a heavily depleted mob with just the 2 boys left in. That's a lot closer to our units, because that squad's going to be quite so reliable to be wiped out by the Tyranid warriors. We could use them as a stepping stone. So as a result, rather than having the Swarm Lord risk the 9-inch charge, which could easily just fail, both units go into the Orc boys. Both of our units get there, as it's really quite a short charge, and then we'll activate first with the Tyranid warriors. The Swarm Lord has managed to roll a 6 and positioned himself in such a way that he's as close as possible to the Gorkanaut, while also being in base-to-base contact with those boys. Then we choose to fight first with the Tyranid warriors, who activate and dispatch the remaining 2 boys in that unit, leaving the Swarm Lord completely unengaged. But as he declared a charge and made a charge move, that does mean that he's still eligible to be selected to fight, even if he's no longer engaged in close combat, and that means that he can make a 3-inch pile-in move and get to the Gorkanaut, and in this case, between the distance of his base, the 3-inch pile-in and 1-inch engagement range, that's enough to get him within engagement range of the walker. Again, that could be another fun way to game a longer charge, but again, this one really isn't without its risks. There's kind of multiple points of failure here. Say the Tyranid warriors could have failed their charge into the Orc boys, which would have ruined things. If they got unlucky, then they wouldn't have been able to strike to free up the Swarm Lord, or if you had a sort of medium-sized enemy unit that wasn't quite so easy to kill, your other melee threat might just roll low, not be able to wipe out that squad, and then your big scary melee threat would have still been stuck and making attacks into the same squad, and not able to pile into the thing that you wanted to. If the chance of those things failing is high enough, that might actually have wound up being worse than just attempting a longish charge with a command point reroll in the bank. In any case, there's plenty of other minor variations or other interesting scenarios that you could do with different factions out there in these tricks. Let me know your thoughts as to some of the finer higher play melee shenanigans that you can do in Warhammer 40k. I look forward to hearing all your takes down in the comments. I would probably say that most of these shenanigans do feel a bit more like they're playing against the way that the game is intended to be played as well. So there might be more things that you'd be cracking out in tournaments and very competitive games, as opposed to more casual games where it's supposed to be a bit more laid back and having fun. Let me know your thoughts though. I look forward to having a read of them down in the comments below. Thanks to Objective Markers for sponsoring this one. Feel free to check out their designs linked down in the video description. They have a whole massive range of them that could apply to various different factions in the game, plus the channel merch Auspex style ones as well. That's about it for this one. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that linked in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.